What if the love of your life wrote you 100 letters, and you never got to read even one? What if your entire life, everything you believed about heartbreak, moving on, and lost love, was built on a lie? In a quiet town in Massachusetts, a 92-year-old man opens an old attic box, and inside it, finds the truth he had been denied for nearly 70 years. He found a dusty box in the attic, and inside it were the love letters that could have changed his entire life, if only he'd read them 70 years ago. The attic smelled like forgotten books and time. James hadn't been up there in years. At 92, climbing steps wasn't exactly part of his routine. But something about that day, maybe the rain outside, maybe the quiet, pulled him toward the past. He moved slowly, each step creaking beneath him like an old song. Cobwebs hung from the wooden beams, and boxes were stacked in every corner. But one box, one simple wooden box tucked beneath a sheet, caught his eye. It wasn't marked. It wasn't labeled. It just waited. James bent down, hands trembling slightly as he pulled the lid open. Inside was a stack of aged envelopes, yellowed, fragile, tied with a red ribbon. On the very top was her handwriting. Evelyn. His heart stopped for a moment. He hadn't spoken her name in decades. Not out loud. Not since the war. Not since he came back and believed she'd moved on. Married someone else. Left him behind. He picked up the first letter, and as he held it in his hand, a dried rose fell out from between the pages. The moment it touched the floor, everything came rushing back. The laughter beneath the oak tree. The poems they shared. The promise to write while he was at war. And the silence that followed. He thought she'd forgotten him. But these letters, these weren't letters of someone who forgot. These were the words of someone who waited. And he never received even one. The year was 1942. Back then, James was just 19. A quiet literature student with dreams bigger than his small Massachusetts town. He spent most afternoons at the local library, reading old novels and scribbling quotes in the margins of his notebook. He believed in the kind of love that only existed in books, until the day he met Evelyn. She entered the library like she already belonged to every page. Wearing a soft yellow dress, with auburn hair tied back and a satchel full of paintbrushes, Evelyn wasn't like anyone James had ever met. She didn't just read stories, she lived them. She spoke of art, jazz, and the kind of freedom that made James feel like he'd spent his whole life asleep. They didn't talk at first. Just exchanged glances over bookshelves and stolen smiles. But one afternoon, she caught him writing a poem in the margin of Wuthering Heights. She picked up the book when he left. Read it. Smiled. And the next day, she left a reply in the same margin. If you're brave enough to write it, I'll be brave enough to read it. That's how it began. They started writing notes in books. Then on napkins. Then full letters. And every Sunday, they met beneath the old oak tree by the lake, where she'd sketch and he'd read her poetry. They never kissed. Never said, I love you. But everything in the way they looked at each other said it for them. In that summer of 1942, time didn't feel real. The world outside was changing, war, fear, headlines. But under that tree, in that moment, they were infinite. Until one day the letter came. James had been drafted. James didn't say much when the draft letter came. He just stared at it, like it was a mistake. Like if he folded it the right way, it would disappear. But it didn't. He had 2 weeks before he had to report. 14 days. And instead of telling Evelyn right away, he waited. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want their time together to start feeling like it was ticking down. But eventually he told her. They were sitting under their oak tree, just like every Sunday. The lake was quiet, and she was sketching his face without even looking at the paper. She always did that, like she had his features memorized. He handed her the letter. Didn't say a word. And she just held it, not crying, not shaking, just quiet. Then she looked up and said, Okay, then we write. And that was it. They made a promise. A real one. He'd write her from wherever he was stationed. Every week, no matter what. And she'd do the same. She told him she'd number her letters, so he'd always know if one went missing. Ink and heart, she said. I'll put both into every single word. Their last Sunday was something out of a dream. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about time running out. They just sat together. Her hand in his head on her shoulder. And as the sun started to set, she pulled out a tiny notebook and started writing the first letter right there, in front of him. He laughed. You can't wait even one day to miss me, huh? She smiled, not looking up from the page. No, I don't want to miss you tomorrow. I'm already missing you today. That letter, he never got it. He never got any of them. And he had no idea that back home, Evelyn was writing him every single week, just like she promised. James didn't know what to expect when he boarded that train. It was strange, really. His whole life, he'd been a small-town guy. Literature and poems, not battles or marching orders. But there he was, surrounded by other young men who seemed just as lost as he felt. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't like the stories. The train ride to the army base felt endless. Each passing mile took him farther away from everything he knew, and most painfully from Evelyn. In those first few days, he wrote to her. Of course he did. Every chance he got. He'd sit in the barracks at night, write a quick letter, fold it carefully, and slip it into an envelope, hoping it would make it to her. Hoping she'd know he was thinking about her, even across the distance. But weeks passed. No word from her. James tried not to worry. Maybe she was busy. Maybe the mail was slow. He told himself that. But in the quiet, when the world was still and all he could hear was his own heartbeat, he wondered. Had she moved on? Had she found someone else? Was she already writing someone new? Those were the questions that kept him awake at night. Still, he wrote. Every single week. He didn't stop. Because that was the promise. He wrote about the places he was, the things he saw, the people he met. But there was always something missing from his words. There was no mention of the war. Not really. Not the way it really was. He tried to write to her the way he'd always done, light, poetic. Like the world outside didn't exist. Like it was just the two of them, together in their own world. But the longer he was gone, the more the silence grew between them. He kept sending letters, and kept getting none in return. By the time James reached his station overseas, months had passed. Months since he'd last heard from Evelyn. Months of writing and waiting, hoping that one day, he'd get a letter back. That one day, he'd wake up and find her words, telling him everything was still the same. Telling him that she was waiting. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the silence between them grew. The more he tried to send her letters, the more his heart sank when he never received a single one in return. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe the mail system was just slow. Maybe she didn't have time to write. But deep down, James knew something wasn't right. He felt the ache of it in his chest every time he sat down to write to her. That familiar feeling of hope being crushed before it could even bloom. He started to wonder if maybe she had changed. Maybe life had moved on without him. Maybe the love they'd shared that summer of 1942 was nothing more than a beautiful memory, locked away in the past. But every letter he sent, he still wrote to her the same way. With hope. With love. With the belief that one day she'd read them. One day he'd hear from her. But time passed, and still no letter came. James had to focus on the war. He had no choice. His mind was pulled away from the thoughts of Evelyn as the days grew harder, and he had no choice but to live in the reality of the battle around him. The hope of returning home and being with her was what kept him going. It was the light at the end of every long, painful day. But in his heart, there was always that nagging feeling. That Evelyn had moved on. That she was writing to someone else now. And that he had never truly mattered. It was a bitter winter when James finally got his leave. He hadn't been home in almost 2 years. Every corner of his hometown felt foreign, like a place that didn't belong to him anymore. The streets were quieter than he remembered. The faces looked different, older, tired. But the hardest part was knowing that Evelyn was still somewhere out there. Somewhere just beyond his reach. He rushed home. Rushed to find her. To make sense of the silence that had haunted him for so long. The moment he stepped into the small library they used to meet in, it felt like everything came rushing back at once. The scent of the old books, the way the light filtered through the windows in the afternoon. It was all exactly how he remembered. But she wasn't there. James asked the librarian, his voice barely a whisper. "Have you seen Evelyn?" The librarian looked up, her face softening with a sadness James hadn't expected. "You don't know?" she asked gently. James' heart stopped. He shook his head. She left a while ago, James. Moved away. Went to New York, I believe. She never came back. James stood there frozen. New York? That was so far away. That was the end of everything. But he still couldn't give up. He asked anyone who might have known her. He checked her old apartment, the places she used to go. But nothing. The town that once felt like home now felt empty. Months passed. His letters, the ones he wrote for all that time, never reached her. He never knew WHY.IT wasn't until nearly 30 years later, when James was in his 60s, that he finally found what he had been searching for. By then, he'd lived a full life, a quiet, unremarkable life in the town he once knew so well. He'd worked, made friends, married, and built a family. But no matter how much time passed, something was always missing. He still carried Evelyn with him, not in a way that consumed him, but as a quiet ache he never spoke of. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when the phone rang. James, now older and slower, picked it up without thinking much of it. "Hello," he said. There was a pause on the other end. Then, a voice he recognized instantly. "James?" It was Evelyn's voice. After all these years, it was unmistakable. James froze. He could hardly breathe. It had been so long. Decades. His heart raced, but he couldn't form the words. "James, it's me, Evelyn. I know this is unexpected, but I need to speak with you." He tried to steady himself, his hands trembling as he held the phone. "Where are you?" he finally managed to ask. His voice cracked just slightly, the years of silence finally catching up to him. "I'm in the city now. New York. I've been here for a long time. But I never meant for you to be left in the dark." James's mind spun. He didn't know what to think. Why had she waited all these years? Why had she never written? Why had she disappeared without a trace? But Evelyn continued. She was apologizing, but there was something more. Something urgent. "I found something. James. Something that might explain everything." That was when she told him about the letters. The letters he had sent every week, every single one. But they'd never reached her. They'd been lost in the mail, intercepted, or somehow never found their way to her hands. She'd written back faithfully. But her letters, they had never made it to him, either. And then Evelyn told him something that made James's heart ache more than it ever had before. "I've been carrying your letters with me all this time. They were all I had. The ones I wrote to you, and the ones you sent me." James didn't know what to say. For all these years, they had been separated by nothing more than missed chances, miscommunications, and letters that never reached their destination. Now, Evelyn was asking him to meet. James barely slept that night. The phone call kept replaying in his head over and over again. All those years. All that time spent wondering, hoping, longing. And now, after all of it, he was finally going to meet her again. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if the years had changed them both, or if they'd pick up right where they left off. But one thing was certain, he had to see her. Evelyn had asked him to meet her at the same library where they'd first met. It felt like a strange twist of fate, like the universe had been waiting for this moment all these years. It had been decades, but as he stood at the door, it almost felt like nothing had changed. The air still smelled of old books, and the windows still let in that soft, golden light. He stepped inside, his heart beating faster now. The old oak tree he and Evelyn used to sit under was still there, standing tall outside. He could almost hear the laughter from their summer afternoons echoing in the back of his mind. And then he saw her. Evelyn. She was standing by the window, just like he remembered. Her red curls were a little grayer now, but her eyes, those eyes, they were the same. The way she looked at him. It was like all the years apart had never existed. It was as though time hadn't passed, and the world around them stood still. She smiled at him softly. "James." He didn't know what to say. All the words he'd held onto for decades, they stuck in his throat. But before he could speak, Evelyn stepped forward, holding something in her hands. It was a small, weathered box. And inside it were the letters. Her letters. His letters. James reached for them slowly. They were old, yellowed with time, edges curling, but they were real. The ink was still legible, though faded, and every word still carried the weight of the love they had shared. But the letters, the ones he'd written to her all those years ago, the ones she'd written to him, they'd never been read by each other, not until now. Years and years of missed words, missed chances, and missed love were all in this box. Evelyn handed him the letters one by one. She had kept them all. She had kept every word he'd ever written her, just as she had promised that summer. She'd never let them go. Tears welled up in James's eyes as he held the first letter, the one he had written to her from basic training. He could feel his heart in each word. "I miss you more than I can say, Evelyn. Every day, every moment, I feel the distance between us. But I believe in us. I believe in you." And then there were her letters, the ones she had written to him, filled with hope and love. But they had never reached him. The one she wrote the night after he left. "I'm holding on to you, James. I know it's not the same, but my love for you is as real as it was that summer." The silence between them was heavy, not out of awkwardness, but out of realization. They had loved each other in ways they never understood before. All those years, they had never truly been apart. They had just missed each other. Evelyn reached out to touch his hand, her voice soft. We never stopped loving each other, James. We just didn't know how to find each other in time. And for the first time in decades, James smiled. They couldn't change the past, but they could finally begin again. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. James and Evelyn spent hours in the library that day. They talked about everything. About the war, about their lives, about the things that had kept them apart. It was as if the years had melted away, and they were once again the young couple under the oak tree, dreaming of their future together. Only now, they had the wisdom of age and the peace of knowing they had never truly forgotten each other. As the sun began to set, they sat together, the box of letters between them. And James finally said the words he had wanted to say for so long. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd known you were waiting for me all this time. Evelyn smiled softly, the years in her eyes glistening. You were always with me, James. In every letter, every thought. I never stopped loving you. Even when I couldn't see you, I could feel you. They decided to take the next step, together. There was no point in holding on to the past anymore, not when they had so much to build on now. They were not the same people they had been when they first met, but that was okay. They had both lived full lives, and they could still have the time they'd lost. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But their love wasn't something that could ever be undone. And now they had their second chance. In the weeks that followed, James and Evelyn grew closer. They talked about everything, made new memories, and slowly began weaving their lives together again. They no longer had to wonder what could have been, because they were finally living it. They spent their days walking through the town they had once known, rediscovering the places they used to visit together. They laughed about how the old oak tree had grown so much taller, just like they had. They smiled at the thought of all the years they'd missed but realized that, in the end, it didn't matter. They had each other now. And then one day, when they were walking by the lake, James reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a folded piece of paper. The very first letter he had ever written her, back when he was still just a boy. I wrote this for you all those years ago, he said, his voice a little shaky. I never got to give it to you then, but I'm giving it to you now. Because I still mean every word. He handed it to Evelyn, and she read it silently, her eyes misting over as she did. She looked up at him and smiled, her face full of love. I always knew you'd come back to me, James, she said, her voice full of warmth. I just had to wait a little longer. And they kissed. Right there by the lake, in the place where they had once dreamed of the future. A future they had finally found. Years passed. But James and Evelyn never looked back. Their days together were filled with simplicity, but that simplicity was everything. It was in the quiet moments, the walks by the lake, the shared laughter over old memories, and the deep, unspoken understanding that they had finally come home to each other. They didn't need grand gestures or sweeping declarations of love anymore. They had spent decades apart, but the time they had now together was the greatest gift they could ask for. Every day felt like a new beginning, and every letter, every word, held more meaning than it ever had before. James kept the box of letters close. He never opened them again, but they remained in his heart, reminders of a love that had endured time, distance, and the pain of separation. He knew the past couldn't be changed, but it had led them to this moment, to this life they were now living side by side. Evelyn, too, kept the letters close. She had them framed on the wall, scattered around their home like pieces of their journey. They had shaped them into who they were, and every letter was a piece of the story they had finally finished writing together. One day, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn turned to James and smiled. Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if we'd just found each other earlier? James smiled back, his heart at peace for the first time in his life. I think about it sometimes, but I'm not sure I would have appreciated this love the way I do now. And so, they sat there in the fading light, holding hands, knowing that whatever the future held, they had already been given the most important thing of all. The chance to be together. They had found each other, at last. And that was all that mattered.